Welcome to the Dream 100 Show, the epicenter of influence, collaboration, and exponential growth. You're about to discover the power of relationships. Dream 100 relationships. And you're one relationship away from a totally different business and life. This is your host, Michael Tesner.
Hey there, and welcome to this week's edition of the Dream 100 Show. Hope you're having a fantastic week. The weather is finally starting to get a little bit warmer in my neck of the woods in Buffalo, New York, but it's still pretty darn cold. Last week, I started the podcast and I talked all about this concept of if not now, when. And the whole premise of that episode was to have you start looking at what are the things that you are saying, oh, I should do this, I should do that, and moving the right projects from shoulds to must, and that's the more important piece, and applying a date. That's why I always talk about this whole notion of if not now, when. If you're like, well, I'm not going to do it now, I'm going to do it someday, fine. But someday never comes. Someday is just so far out there that it's telling me that it's just not a priority. But what I've found when people do not want to put a hard date, as they start to kind of pause a little bit, they start to hesitate. I'm like, all right, well, when are you going to do it by? Yeah. So one of two things is happening. Either it's not really a priority, and it really shouldn't be a priority, but most often it's B. And B is they start to move into scarcity mindset. The fear portion of their brain kicks in. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but from a marketing perspective, I've had to learn, obviously, a lot about human psychology. And one of my earliest mentors, a gentleman named Matthew Ferry, who happened to be a client, and then he turned into a mentor, and it just was a great situation. Amazing life coach. He talks all about mindset and just a lot of really great topics. He said, Michael, your brain is all about keeping you safe. Your brain is solely focused on keeping you alive. So any kind of potential fear, danger, issues, it's going to freeze up. It's going to have you pause and try and get back to a state of like calm and, all right, we're not going to go that far. But the problem with that is that I don't know any highly successful entrepreneur that hasn't had to take some calculated risks. And there's a big difference between this fear mindset, scarcity mindset, and like just jumping off a cliff and just kind of free falling. And I want you to start to rethink your fear, rethink your scarcity as, can I take a calculated risk? Is this calculated risk potentially worth the payout? And almost every single time I've slowed down and started to analyze it. And I'm going to walk you through how I analyze it. I'm going to analyze an exact thing that I'm looking at as we speak, because the scarcity mindset affects me as well. It affects everyone. I'm not going to pretend that it's never affected me and that I haven't made a decision out of scarcity. I'll talk about one that I just made, and I'll talk about one I made last year. But I'm also going to unpack that for you live so that you can actually see that had I taken this as a calculated risk, I believe the outcome would have been far different. So scarcity is the opposite side of abundance. When you have a scarcity mindset, and I also want to clarify something because I don't want to get it overly confused, but scarcity is different from fear. I mean, fear can kind of play a factor with scarcity, but scarcity tends to mean that you're thinking small, you're worrying about certain things. So for example, and I work in a variety of niches, but one of the niches that I work in is childcare. We work with a lot of childcare centers on the agency side. And almost every one of the center owners come from scarcity mindset around their prices. They have a mindset that if they raise their prices, everyone's going to leave, all their kids are going to be gone, tuition's going to go to zero, they're going to be closing their doors. That is a scarcity mindset. If they were to reframe that and say, all right, what's the worst that could happen? And then what are some calculated risks that we can actually take? Maybe they're thinking of raising their tuition 10%, but they say, well, let's start with 3% or 5% and see what happens. And they roll out a 5% increase, and maybe one family complains or two, and maybe one family leaves. But then they quickly replace that family at not only the 5% increase rate, but the actual 10% that they were going to do the entire time. And they very quickly start to realize that the worst case scenario is rarely ever going to happen. I would also push back and challenge you and say, well, what if everything goes right? What if everything actually goes right? So I do have this mentality where I'll look at a situation and then I'll start to ask myself, like, what is the absolute worst thing that could happen? We do a lot of acquisitions. So I could say I buy this business, it goes to zero, and I lose X amount of money. And then I can start to unpack that and say, okay, if I were to take this as a calculated risk, if I were to remove the scarcity mindset, I've now unpacked what's the worst that could happen and the business goes to zero. And let's say that I have, $100,000 at stake. Now there's obviously a difference between 100,000 and a million or 10 million. I mean, there's different levels here, but in the grand scheme of things, your level of scarcity versus abundance versus fear versus calculated risk is going to be different. If you have an organization that's doing $20 million a year, you're not going to be overly concerned by taking a $100,000 calculated risk. Whereas if you're operating a $500,000 a year business, maybe you've got $150,000 worth of profit after taking a salary, you might want to look at that $100,000 and say, yeah, that would wipe out our profit for a year, making the assumption that we don't grow. Would it crush us? Maybe, maybe not. So don't get too hung up on 10,000 versus 100,000, and it's not simply going to be money. We're going to talk through other areas, as we just did, being a price increase. But at the end of the day, I mean, it does largely come down to money. If you're buying an acquisition, you're putting out money, you're investing time, resources, and there's obviously a lot of other things to look at. But if I were to look back a year ago, I looked at starting a new business in the home services space. And I invested about $50,000, maybe even closer to $75,000. Branding, logo, trademark, website. Obviously, we can do all that stuff, at my cost and build through my agency. But I started buying some equipment. I started leasing some space. And then fear kicked in. And I started looking at this saying, geez, can I actually fulfill what we're set to fulfill? What happens if I get sick? What happens if someone quits? What if we don't make enough money to pay the bills? And I started getting into my head. And the reason that also started to happen was that I had an investment property in Orlando, Airbnb property, that started tanking at the same time. We also were on a little bit of a dry spell with adding new business. So like all of these things started coming at me at one time. And rather than me looking at this from a calculated risk standpoint, saying, okay, how much am I set to potentially lose if everything goes wrong, we get no business, I have to pay for all these things for the next 6 months? And the number would have been, let's call it $30,000 or $40,000. So like $5,000 a month over roughly a 6-month time period. Not a small amount of money, but not something that would potentially bankrupt me. And rather than me leaning in and saying, okay, I can take a calculated risk because the potential payoff could be far greater, I fell into my own trap. I had my limiting beliefs and I really talked myself out of it. It's too much work. It's too much time right now. I need to focus elsewhere. I don't want to lose this money because we've got money coming out over here. The business isn't growing. Can we fund this loss? And everything compounded me into the scarcity zone. Now, had I, again, looked at this as more of an opportunity risk, looked at that, okay, $30,000 as well as some time, I would be a year farther along. We would have had some jobs under our belt to have some case studies and some actual customer houses and success stories and things like that. I'd have a business that is something that I've been talking about for 2 years. So this whole if not now when, and I got to the point where last year I'm like, if not now when, it's now. And I wouldn't be back into that cycle. And seeing this particular area of home services continuing to grow, I would actually have a piece. And I'm sure that I would have paid off the $30,000 and potentially had a business on track or already hitting a 7-figure mark. But I let scarcity. Another situation, I'm looking at investing, I believe it's $30,000 or $35,000 into a particular coaching program. Now, I invest a lot of money in masterminds, coaches, memberships. I'm in the Entrepreneurs Organization, that's give or take $10,000 a year. I'm in Strategic Coach, that's give or take $10,000 a year. I'm in a agency mastermind, that's give or take $30,000 a year. I just purchased a course for $10,000 and a group mentorship. I'm in something called capitalism. So I invest and I practice what I preach by way of training, coaches, mentors. If someone that's trying to train you, like myself, isn't also investing in coaches and trainers and mentors, it would be very hypocritical of me to be aiming to mentor you and guide you and teach you and show you the way. But I'm looking at adding on another one of these courses, mentorships, etc., at the price tag of $30,000. And I looked back at the messages and the back and forth, and I've been kind of teetering the line for about a year. And I realized it was the same thing that was grabbing me. But what if it doesn't work? What if it doesn't? And that, my friends, is one of the biggest things that is holding you back. What if it doesn't work? What if it actually does work? What if you learn one new skill that doubles your business? I've shown you proof, and I've talked about the Dream 100 framework. Deploy it for people all day, every day. If you're interested, michael@d100.com. I'd be happy to have a conversation. All day, every day. And it's proven that within 12 months, we have landed anywhere between 2 and 4 Dream 100 relationships, if not more. So, Michael, 2 to 4 out of 100, that's not great. The criteria of a Dream 100 relationship is it has to be able to double your business. So 2 to 4, your business is going to grow at least 200% over a 12-month period. You have to start looking at all the different areas as an investment. You have to move from scarcity over to abundance. What if it actually does work? What if the $5,000 you invest in a new website doubles your website traffic? What if investing in this new coaching program catapults X? What if you change your mindset in a different space that you've never been before because that one coach, that one book, that one mentor helped you reframe the entire way that you think? And I can give you case study upon case study upon case study of how this has happened and occurred in my life. When I have bet on myself, when I have gotten out of my head from scarcity and fear and moved over to abundance, everything has changed. When I have said that I'm worthy of all these new things, when I'm worthy to be able to grow a business and grow my impact and help more people, everything starts to change. So my challenge for you today is to look at what areas in your life, in your business, are you playing at the scarcity mindset and saying, well, what if it doesn't work? I'm investing $3,000 a month. It doesn't work. I'm out 20 grand and I'm in a hole. What if it does work? What if it does work? And how are you going to speed up the process? How are you going to grow if you're not willing to invest? This is a game of investment in taking calculated risks based on data, based on facts, and also sometimes based on gut. Take one area in your life, take one area in your business, commit to changing your mindset from what if it doesn't work to what if it does work. From scarcity, I don't have the money, I can't afford it, to I can afford it. This is going to help transform my business. One thing, move the needle, watch what happens around you, watch how your mindset starts to shift, and your business and your life will shift with it. Michael Tasner signing off. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night. I'll see you next week.